This screencast lecture is on how industry changed America, focusing on the Ford Motor Company in the Detroit area. In the early 19th century, the average American was a farmer. They worked on the farm, which was a very difficult life, from sun up to sundown, and they were mainly in control of the operation of their own farm. They were their own boss. In the mid-1800s, farm life begins to change, especially with emerging technologies like the tractor, and this basically makes the job of a farm worker obsolete. So new machines and technology save labor, but there's less work in rural areas, especially the South. And by the time the 20th century, the 1900s, rolls around, there are not enough jobs in rural areas when the children of the farmers grow up. In the North, factories are also changing. Technology is making the need for workers even greater. So whereas in the South, farm life is pushing people away because of technology, in the factories, technology is pulling people in to the city. So now for these people that are leaving the farms, there are new jobs in the North. It creates new jobs that are like factory work, and industries are also growing because of the demand for their products. Most of the people that are moving from the South are moving to northern cities like New York, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland. Both African Americans and whites are migrating from the rural South to the urban North, although there was a great number of African Americans moving from the South, especially during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. This mass migration of African Americans is known as the Great Migration. They're not only moving for jobs, but they're also moving to escape social issues like racism and lack of education. African Americans are mostly moving to the North, but they're also moving to the Midwest and the West, to places like California. The term to describe this mass migration is known as the Great Migration. The pictures you see here will show the changes that are happening in urban areas in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. The picture on the left depicts Detroit in 1890. Both intersections in the two pictures are the same. This is Woodward Avenue and 4th Street. The picture in 1890 shows less people. It shows horse-drawn carriages, horse-drawn train cars, and dirt roads. The picture in 1917 of Woodward and 4th Street shows much more people, more buildings, motorized streetcars, automobiles, and the most significant change is more people. The reason for this will be talked about in further slides. The man you see here is Henry Ford. This picture is taken in 1904. It's the first official Ford Motor Company portrait of him. Henry Ford, like many Americans in the late 19th century, moves from his farm, which he actually had in Michigan, in Dearborn. He moves in 1879 to Detroit. He becomes an apprentice under a machinist for about 3 years and learns his trade, and later develops the internal combustion engine. But he also returns back to his farm for several occasions. Henry Ford eventually settles permanently in Detroit in 1891, and his business, the Ford Motor Company, provides jobs for millions of people who, like him, grew up on farms, but the opportunities washed up. The picture you see on the right is of the Highland Park assembly plant, The date is January 1914, and it's the day after Ford announces the $5 a day program, which at that point increases wages by around 50%. So you see thousands of people here waiting for applications to work in the Ford plants. We discussed in conversation during the lecture of why Henry Ford would want to increase wages. One of the major things we pointed out is that by paying your workers more, not only does it make them more happy and it wants them to stay longer and work longer, but it also allows them to become a consumer for the product they're creating. So Ford, by giving his workers more money, he's not only investing in their happiness and security, but he's also creating a whole new set of consumers for his product, which they could never buy beforehand. The growth of the automobile industry has a major impact on Michigan, on the Midwest, all of America, and all of the world. The $5 a day program not only affects the automobile industry, but also supporting industries like steel, like the rubber industry, the textile industry, because those industries now have to increase their wages as well. But Ford also has another major development in the industrial system. He develops the assembly line concept where mass production can take place. People can do more in the same amount of hours. They can create more products and sell more, and it drives the cost of production down. Yes, you do actually employ more people, which costs more, but they produce more products, which will make more money in the long run. And by 1927, Ford dominates the automobile industry and sells about 15 million Model Ts. The Model T is seen here on the right. The next few slides are bar graphs showing the 5 largest cities in the United States based on population. You notice on this one in 1910, we have 5 cities: New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and Boston. New York City being the largest, with about 4.75 million people. Boston with the lowest, with a little less than 1 million people, although it's still in the top 5. Between 1910 and 1920, the next census, the cities change. The top 3 are still the same, they're growing, but the bottom 2, because of the automobile industry, are growing at a much faster rate. Detroit wasn't even in the top 10 in 1910, now they're in the top 4 with about 1 million people. That is mainly because of the $5 a day announcement in 1914. Cleveland, which is a supporting city, they are home to some of the oil industry, some of the rubber industry, and they're growing as well because Detroit's growing with the automobile industry. 1930, Cleveland drops off. Some of the western cities are growing, like LA, and that becomes the 5th largest city. Detroit is over 1 million people at almost 1.5 million people in 1930. By this time, the workers of these factories are beginning to demand more rights and better working conditions, because at that time many of these factories are becoming more mechanized, which makes them also more dangerous. So a lot of these laborers, especially the unskilled workers, are trying to associate together in unions so that with more people they can control the way things run in the business a little more. Before that time, a lot of the unions that were established in America were of skilled labor only, so like the masons, steel workers. Now, at this point in factories, a lot of the workers are unskilled laborers, so they didn't really have a lot of control over what was going on in the factory itself as far as working conditions. Now in the 1920s and 30s, that starts to change, and especially the auto workers start to really associate and unionize, and this changes the way that the auto industry runs. We talked in class about some of the pros and cons of having a union. Really, all of the pros are for the people that work in the business itself, for the worker. On the other hand, for the business, it's mostly all the cons. Nothing really good comes out of having a union for a business owner. So for a person that works in a factory, some of the pros are they could go on strike and they could possibly get better pay, better benefits like insurance, and better working conditions. On the other hand, the cons for business owners are your workers stop working, so you really produce less. So you're at a point where the workers are controlling how production really is ran. So a lot of these business owners try to stop unions from forming. A major thing they do is they offer contracts to people only if they give their signature saying they will not form or join a union. They will not hire suspected union organizers. That's called blacklisting. They lock workers out and refuse to pay them if they start organizing. They also hire scabs, which are replacement workers. They call them strike breakers formally, but in Detroit, scabs are a very bad thing for unions because they're basically replacement workers that cross the picket lines and work in place of you. Some businesses would even hire security forces to make sure strikes couldn't happen. Ford did this with the Pinkertons. Unions caused problems for businesses in the 20s and 30s, and before this time and during this time, the government takes the stance that unions are not going to win this battle. They try to back up the business because the business is really what has influence in America at that time. Unions are still pretty weak as far as political influence, so the government backs up the business. There are no laws protecting the rights to organize, so a union basically can face anything that the business hands them. Court ruled that strikes were conspiracies that interfered with trade, and they also gave and spread the perception that unions threaten American institutions like business, like the Ford Motor Company. They also label unions as Marxist, which basically means that they're a form of socialism or communism. At that time is a very bad thing to be associated with yourself. They label them as anarchists, people that disrupt social order, or revolutionaries, which again, at this point, it's not a good thing to be labeled. And that's going to be it for the industry lecture. I hope you learned something and this helps you supplement your preparation for this semester exam.